this thing is like.
You can go grab Economists.
Oh, the Economist. Oh, here.
It is streaming.
Good.
Oh, good. This looks all flaky, but that doesn't.
Okay, so to move this forward.
Okay, let me see. I don't use.
I'm just trying to do as much research as I can right now without really.
Like that. Would you like it on slideshow instead of on
There's a lot of examples that are so
the way it is?
Slideshow.
You know, the, hang on. Slideshow. From beginning.
Yeah, it's covered.
There. And it's the page up, page down.
Right. It's not really a list,
Yeah,
it's
there
just
you go.
one group, right?
Right.
Establish a.
And that's why I was thinking it was
with, or,
okay.
yeah. I don't know right now, and then, yeah, you work to figure out exactly
on the lower
It's
end.
pretty clear that this is the first year
You
they're
have to
doing
melt down
some
around the
message testing.
professors.
Like qualitative testing.
Yeah.
For public works.
She gets an A, yeah, it's not stable.
And then what the role
Or
of
just,
that-
we, we'll give you the.
She tried hard, yeah.
But yeah,
Especially because
very
others are doing,
couched
in your class,
up to
doing
this many
projects
dollars,
and
depending on budget.
and
So
we're
we have,
doing
like,
this
you know, the division
much better
of.
person.
Well, there aren't very many more
So
people.
interesting
Okay.
projects.
Yeah.
That's the way they are. It's not very many. Well, we can get started
Entire
then.
group.
Yeah, we'll get one more.
The other thing, 5 years.
Okay, let's, might as well get started. I don't think there are very many more people here today. A few more. So I'm pleased to introduce our guest. You probably already know, this is Chris Southcott, who's, and I'll probably get it wrong because I didn't check any of this, but last I checked, he was professor of sociology at Lakehead University, which is in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Those of you like Lee Huskey who are familiar with the region, it's sort of the Canadian equivalent of Duluth. It's sort of, right, it's across the bay. It's actually,
Closest city
if you
to
go by water, it's probably the closest city.
Yeah.
But he's going to talk about the ReSDA project, which acronym, I'll probably get that wrong too, but I think it's Resources for Sustainable Development of the in the Arctic. But it's broadly about how it was like 5-year initiative from
7 years.
7 years from it's funded by the Canada's Social Science and Humanities Research Council with the aim of to try to improve the benefits that northern communities get from resource development.
Good.
Talk about the legacy, what they learned, what they found.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so today, first of all, thanks for letting me speak here. It was one of the places that I wanted to come now that we're at the sort of the closing stages of this project that's been going on for, well, almost 8 years now, ReSDA. I wanted to come to ISER because our ISER is one of the places that inspired a lot of the original questions behind the ReSDA project. And so it's very fitting that I come here to talk about how really the ReSDA research tried to build on research that was done previously in ISER and is also being done currently in Alaska. So thanks for letting me speak here today. So first of all, I'll talk very briefly about what the main idea. It's a project that had a very easy to understand focus for people who live in the north. It's the idea that started to develop in the 1990s in Canada that previously resource development had been problematic for Canada. We had a commission in the 1970s that showed, called the Berger Commission, that showed how many problems that resource development had caused in northern communities, and that really resource development wasn't a good idea for northern communities. And in fact, as a result of the Berger Commission, we had a moratorium on a lot of resource development in our north for many years. But by the 1990s, many northern communities were starting to look at resource development as a potential solution to many of their challenges. And so this project really grew out of that idea and of trying to find a way to ensure that you could have resource development for northern communities that helped their sustainability rather than hindered it. And in many ways, it was inspired by what was going on in Duluth. Well, in many ways, it was inspired by what was going on in Duluth, but and I can answer that question later. ReSDA actually did a presentation with Lee at the University of the University of Minnesota Duluth on this idea, but in Alaska, built up with the ReSDAs, of course, when the resource curse discourse started in the 1990s. The idea was that resource development was not a good thing for regions, and it was well known that in many parts of the world, resource development has caused economic problems for regions. If you are overly dependent on resource development, then you're going to have economic problems. And even looking at the American states here, you see this well-known graph by Goldberg, the economist, shows that those states that are overly dependent on resource development have a lower per capita income. So it's not a good form of economic development, except of course for this area right here, which is Alaska. So Alaska has always been the outlier. And in Canada, many of the northern communities, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s, when we started to sign our land claim agreements that Alaska signed in 1971, the ANCSA Treaty, when we started to sign similar agreements in Canada, a lot of the indigenous organizations looked to Alaska as a potential model to follow. And here's an example, because they knew that Alaska had a certain amount of success in terms of development in many respects. So they saw Alaska as a potential model for resource development. So as I said, that's one of the reasons that one of the background ideas for ReSDA. So it's good for me to talk here at ISER. Very briefly, in terms of what ReSDA is, it's a project that started in 2011. It ends this year. It involved a lot of researchers. It's an international project. It involves researchers from across the circumpolar north. Matt's been involved, Lee's been involved, Diane's been involved. So we tried to integrate, but the research itself is focused on Canada's north. As Matt pointed out, we get our core funding from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We have a main focus, easy to understand main focus. We're based largely at Yukon College in Whitehorse. That's where our coordination office is, and we also have had coordination offices in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Labrador. So that's a basic introduction to the project. We have projects in a variety of regions of Canada. This is a map that shows most of the main projects that we've dealt with and where their main locations are. We started out with a series of gap analyses in 2011, where we looked at what were we didn't want to redo a lot of things, and we knew that, including a lot of researchers at ISER had already done a lot of this research. So we wanted to find out what was already existing and what to build on. And so we had a series of gap analyses that were done by the various people, and you'll notice that several of them involved people from Alaska, Andre Schweitzer, who when this started was at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Lee, of course, and Henry Huntington were all involved in this at that stage. And that was turned into a book which was published last year with Rutledge. But then based on that gap analysis, we had meetings with our major partners, and we decided on a series of about 16 projects that we would fund that looks at various aspects of the central question: how to ensure resource development benefits main communities in northern Canada. And so that's what I'll talk about today, is the results of these 16 projects. Some of them still haven't finished, so I'll only be talking about tentative results. Some of these things I'm not as familiar as I should because they're still finishing up their conclusions, but I'll do my best to talk about each of these things. And so I'll go project by project, and I'll try and spend about 1.5 minutes on each project, and then if you have any questions, perhaps after, I can go back to those. But first of all, one of the first ones that we did was a project called Finding That Works, and it looks at mining projects in the Inuit areas of Canada to try and find out what's the best way of doing mining that produces the best and most jobs for Inuit people. It's a project that was the idea of one of the directors of Nunavut Tungavik, which is the land claim organization for the Nunavut region. Natan Obed, who is currently the president of ITK, the main Inuit organization in Canada. He was the main force behind it. And it was just, it's a project that looks at all of the different mines to find out what's the best practices in these mines and under what conditions can northern communities get, good jobs out of good jobs that build capacity in these communities. And so I won't go into a lot of details. First of all, point out that there are still major problems in terms of employment for Indigenous people in northern Canada, and the successes are not at all what they had hoped. Alaska, from own studies that have been done by ISER in Alaska, I think the Red Dog mine, they had hoped at one time 100% employment for Indigenous peoples at the Red Dog, and what is it now, Matt, 57% or something like that? At Red Dog is Indigenous. So
It's close.
yeah. So in Canada, it's not even as good as the Red Dog yet. But we've tried to see what's likely to improve the situation. Then we looked at, people were very concerned with looking at gender relations because when new mines are proposed for northern Canada, often it's women in the communities who are most concerned about the new mines opening up. And they're concerned primarily with the negative impacts of the booms that come with a new mine opening up, drug and alcohol, family violence, and things like that. So we had a series of community meetings in areas that, several areas that had mines open up recently to talk to women about their concerns in mining, and that was led by Suzanne Mills at McMaster University. It involved the Sawtooth Renewable Resources Board, Northwestern Ontario, or Northwestern Territories, and several other researchers. So what they found was that despite one gets the image that women are largely opposed to mining when a new mine opens up, because in the press, it's, you have these articles about the concern surrounding drug and alcohol abuse and family violence increasing. But in fact, in these meetings, we found that the women are not opposed, in fact, are often in favor, but that they're concerned that their concerns are not taken into account when the mine is being planned. And what they want is a way that they can be, that their concerns can be taken into account to a greater extent than they do now. So. And then we built on a lot of the work that was done by ISER, by Jack Cruz and others on measuring social and economic impacts from resource development. We tried to build on that. And Andrei Petrov, who was here yesterday, I don't think he came to ISER, did he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he had lunch here.
Oh, he had lunch here, okay. In conjunction with the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, they wanted to find out how to use a lot of that work that was done in Alaska, but integrate their own local components into it. And so we sort of it was sort of integrating what had been done at ISER previously and what had been done with the Arctic Social Indicators Project, which some of you, Diane, you were involved in that, and Matt, you were involved in it, and Lee. Yeah, so you've been involved, people here have been involved in that. So they tried to integrate that, and looking at the situation, they tried to develop new forms of local forms of measurement, and try to find out how to use those forms of measurements to try and increase local control of data collection and analysis and to build capacity. And then we wanted to find out, how to measure, following up the idea of measurement is how to follow the money. And so Lee and I actually have been looking at the Yukon as a way, as a model to try and measure resource revenue flows, and to try and find out how you can ensure that larger percentages of those revenue flows stay in the region without, of course, negatively impacting those flows. And so we tried to develop models, and then we decided to look at one particular mine and try and measure all the flows, plus the idea that you can't really separate revenues from other benefits. And so we're now looking at trying to understand all the benefits and negative impacts that arise from a particular mine, and introduce those notions into a new model. And we're looking at the Faro mine, which is the major mine, historically the largest mine to ever happen in the Yukon, and existed from 1968 to 1997. We were building on this idea. Once again, Jack Cruz did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s looking at, and I think 90s too, on the impacts of oil and gas development on subsistence harvesting. And so despite his work, we found that most people just assumed that that resource development is just going to have a negative impact on harvesting. It's sort of one of you go through a lot of, when we did the gap analysis, a lot of studies just assumed that as a given. And there was no sort of sourcing that or anything. It's just assumed that it was a given. And so Dave Natcher at the University of Saskatchewan, who used to be here, he started looking at, what are the barriers, and including areas that have resource development, what are the barriers to subsistence harvesting? And he found that, based on these studies, which included Alaska in this particular research, these are the communities, when he's looking at what the communities believe are the barriers, it's almost equally either a lack of time or a lack of money are the major barriers to subsistence harvesting. Climate change was not mentioned in any of the surveys that he did, or the interviews that he did. But that was very important, and that resource development, the idea behind in Natcher's thing was that in areas where lack of money is a concern, resource development is seen by the people that live in the region as a way of helping with subsistence harvesting, by providing them money to buy the tools to do subsistence harvesting. In other areas where time is an issue, it may not be that, it may not be a plus, it may be a negative because they don't have the time to go on the land. But then the second stage of that was that, and this was published in a journal called Food Security. And then we did a second article, we did a second research on sort of building on Jack Cruz's research from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s on, what's the actual, when a mine goes in, does subsistence harvesting increase or does it decrease? And we found that most of the, and we used, nowadays in Canada, there are, with environmental impact assessments, you have monitoring. We were able to use that monitoring data, and that data is not the best data, But the data that does exist indicates that, resource development does appear to actually help subsistence harvesting, which runs counter to the dominant ideas that exist out there, the assumptions people have. So that was sort of an interesting thing. Then, of course, as you know, in Alaska and in Canada, we have these impact benefit agreements that have come into being over the past 20 years. And when we did the gap analysis, there was a desire that we, talk to communities to try and find out what they like about these impact benefit agreements and what they don't like about these impact benefit agreements. So we had Ben Bradshaw from the University of Guelph have a series of meetings in various communities in the north that I had in mind to try and find out what the major problems are with current impact benefit agreements. And so based on that research, he's come up with several suggestions to improve impact benefit agreements. And the main underlying ideas is that these impact benefit agreements are done in a haphazard fashion and are not sort of integrated into any sort of, into a coherent planning. And that's one of the biggest problems for according to the communities, for impact benefit agreements in northern Canada. And then we had a project that tried to look at how Indigenous communities in the north could benefit from fly-in, fly-out. The idea was that fly-in, fly-out, well, it's a good idea. Many communities feel it's a good idea because it isolates them from many of the problems that can develop when you have boom times, mines coming into the area. It sort of isolates those communities. But at the same time, the communities themselves, many communities wanted to benefit from the employment and participate. The possibilities of participating in fly-in and fly-out. Previous studies done by Gertie Saxinger in Siberia has shown the problems that accompany fly-in, fly-out, problems for families, et cetera. And so she did a project working with the Natcher in Mayo, Yukon, to look at who've had a long history of interactions as fly-in, fly-out or drive-in, drive-out miners in the region to develop sort of a best case analysis of what you need to do to ensure so that you can benefit from this and still maintain sustainable communities. And a guidebook was developed for communities in northern Canada. Resource royalties distribution and community development. This is a project led by Thierry Rodin in Université Laval in conjunction with the Makovic Corporation, which is the land claim organization for northern Quebec, for Nunavik. And what Makovic was very concerned about is that when they have had several mines opening up, most importantly the Raglan mine in northern Quebec, is that the communities want to know, once they get those royalties, how should they distribute those royalties? Because you can give them to individuals, you can write checks every year to individuals, or you can have that money go to a sovereign wealth fund, or it can go to other purposes. And so what Thierry Rodin has been doing is he's been looking at the experiences of the different communities that have had different types of distribution systems and comparing them and seeing what the communities think of those. And he, in fact, included the Red Dog mine in his studies. He was here. Did Thierry come and speak at ISER when he was here?
Yes.
No? Okay.
Wish he would.
Pardon me?
I wish he would.
Yeah.
It's from Laval.
It's quite good.
It's a long way from Quebec City.
Yeah. And so, based on his analysis, they found basically that collective investments tend to have the most long-term benefits. That use of a sovereign wealth fund, properly managed, has can maximize benefits in terms of long-term sustainable futures. But at the same time, there points out that there are many instances when individual distributions are also useful, because when you have individual distributions, for example, subsistence harvesting increases substantially. This is the one thing. When you had an individual thing, subsistence harvesting rates increased. And so that's one plus. Or when you have rates of extreme poverty, when you have communities with extreme poverty, then that alleviates the problem. So there are instances, although generally his studies seem to think communities are by and large more happier with the collective, some sort of collective sovereign fund to fund local, and to fund education especially is one that communities like the most. There are instances when it is necessary, individual things will help the communities as well. So that's the findings from his project. Environmental legacies, this was the idea, when we started out, a lot of the communities were saying, well, we have all these environmental legacies in our region, which is a nice play of saying, these abandoned mines that are, causing major problems and could be potentially damaging to our environment. And so in Canada, in particular, we have two large ones, the giant mine in Yellowknife, where it's now estimated that the federal government was responsible for paying for the cleanup, because under the original, when the mine opened up, we didn't have these environmental laws or anything, and so the federal government is responsible for cleaning up, and it's going to cost them about $1 billion. In the Yukon, we have the Faro mine, where the cleanup is now estimated at about $500 million for the cost of the Faro mine. So what the communities there are, the communities are saying, well, how, if that money's going to be spent there, how can we benefit from that money being spent? And so we had a project looking at remediation as a form of economic development, and how can that be done so that local communities can benefit. So a study done by John Samuels and Art Keeling with Ann Dance as a postdoc looked at that, at those, and came up with some suggestions for when remediation is done, how local communities become involved and greater control can be done, and benefits can be passed on to local communities. And we also wanted to see how, this stems from Sharman Haley, who used to be at ISER, and I forget his first name, his last name is Fisher.
Vic?
Vic, is that his name? Yeah. They did a report for ISER in 2012, which actually became quite well known in the Inuvialuit region, where they pointed out that the Red Dog mine had increased graduation rates, or at least that was the takeaway from that. And that's what everybody wanted to find out is the Red Dog mine, when you talk to people, they said, well, the Alaskans, when they've had the Red Dog mine, all of a sudden their graduation rates increased, their high school graduations increased. So what we want to find is we want a project that tries to find out how you can use, resource development to increase our graduation rates, like they did on Alaska. And so, so we have this project we included with training and employment, and when you go to eastern Arctic Canada, however, they weren't even at the stage of thinking about high school graduation. They were thinking of what they wanted us to look at was how they could get some training, at rudimentary training, so that they could get jobs and keep their jobs in the mines that were opening up. We had a project that's because there were no mines, there was no active resource development in the Inuvialuit region, the idea for this came from. We had a project with Baffinland's Mary River Mine in Nunavut. And the Andrew Hodgkins, who's linked to the University of Alberta and the Hamlet of Pond Inlet, and they're trying to determine how to maximize training. Well, before you can even maximize training, you have to figure out how to get jobs for the people and then get training on the jobs. What his research found was that the people can't even get jobs and keep jobs for a long period of time because of because of alcohol and drug problems and other problems. And so although the mine, makes an effort to hire originally, they can no longer hire people in Pond Inlet because they have had previous problems with drug and alcohol abuse, and it's a safety issue on the mine site. And so his project just became involved in looking at that aspect of employment training. And so the great, in northern Canada, the great problem is trying to get workers hired at the mines for and stay on at the mines. Right now, there's, even if theoretically the notion that, the image everybody has is, well, at the Red Dog mine, everybody knows that if they finish high school, they can get a job at the Red Dog mine and life will be good. Nobody thinks that in northern Canada because the idea of that they'll get a job, long-term job at the mine is foreign to them. So you have to solve that problem first. So that's Andrew Hodgkin's work. And then, as I say, I've run out of my time already, but we have other projects. Housing is a big concern. So the community says, well, wanted a project to look at how can we improve housing in our communities with resource development projects. So we have Julia Christensen, who's at Memorial University, and Lisa Freeman, who's at Kwantlen University, working with Alternatives North, which is an advocacy group in Northwest Territories, looking at how mining can help improve housing in northern communities. That one still hasn't reported yet, so I can't really say anything. Well-being and the impacts of resource development. Brenda Parley, along with other people, including Mark Nuttall at the University of Alberta, are looking at the different meanings of well-being and trying to establish a better idea of what communities want from resource development in terms of the well-being for their communities, which will help us better understand how to consider benefits and benefits from resource development. And so that's a project that still hasn't reported. We had a project that looked at waste management and turning waste into jobs. We had, and this came out of Labrador, the communities in Labrador said, well, we have a hydroelectric development, the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric development going on, and they said we have all this waste that is being developed and it's being wasted. How can we use use waste management to improve the well-being of northern communities? And so we have a project that looked at that. Bruno Wichmann from the University of Alberta, along with Ninu Vialo, sort of building on the indicators project that we had led by Andrei Petrov, is sort of building more robust models and an actual mechanism for communities to better control data analysis so that they can keep track of what the impacts are. Philanthropy, one of the big things when a mine comes in, a mining company will give a lot of money for scholarships and things like that. And the question from several communities was, well, is this money being spent, the philanthropy, is it being spent in the way that it should be? And so we're having a project that looks at what communities think of the various philanthropy attempts by mining companies in the north. And then we have a project, an associated project that is actually not funded by us because he got money from ArcticNet, who has a lot more money than we have. Stefan Schott from Carleton University is looking at using extractive resource development to improve business development in regions, and that's with the Mackinac Corporation. And so that is a very quick summary of our main projects. If I was going to talk about general findings that we have for ReSDA, I would say that most communities in northern Canada right now, they believe that the potential exists for us to use extractive industry, which for a lot of academics in Canada, sort of foreign, who were raised sort of in the 70s and 80s when, you know, resource development was disastrous for northern communities in Canada, and people still have that perception. Yet in the regions, most people look at mining, especially oil and gas if they can get it, but mining especially, as being important for their future. There's very few options for them, and so they believe that now that they have their land claims settled and they have control, they believe the situation, and they can use mines to their own benefit. There's that sort of optimism that exists in most of the communities. But that they're very aware that dangers still remain. So in terms of the findings, is first of all, a big difference between where I live, in the provincial north, where I live, is that we have what are called historic treaties, you know, which were signed 100 years ago. And under those conditions, you know, local control is extremely limited. But under the new land claims, following up on the work that was done under ANCSA, Canadian modern comprehensive land claim agreements in Canada built on ANCSA. In fact, they took ANCSA, they said, well, we'll take all the good things from ANCSA, and then we'll fix all the bad things that were associated with ANCSA, and we'll have, you know, better ANCSAs. And that's been largely successful, I think, at least in the minds of the communities, and they're quite happy with their land claim agreements in the region. But, you know, if they don't have a modern land claim agreement, then problems tend to develop in the community. So in terms of takeaways, if communities can control the situation, if communities can't control the situation, then probably they're not probably going to benefit very much from resource development. Capacity is an issue. You know, it's one thing to be able to say, well, we'll hire anybody who's got a high school diploma, you know, we'll hire them. Well, there's only, you know, 2 people in our community who has a high school diploma, so you can't hire anybody in our community. And so capacity continues to be an issue in northern communities. Culturally appropriate institutions, that these are still largely foreign institutions. You know, mining companies come in, you know, we have to recognize that mining companies are making an effort to try and integrate culturally appropriate practices, but largely they're foreign entities, which are still major problems for the communities becoming involved in these projects and benefiting from them in other than just from royalties. And so that's a major problem. And once again, if they are really successful, you know, as Alaskans now know, once you're successful in getting a great society built from a non-renewable resource, once that resource either runs out or prices for that resource declines and you don't have that resource, then you have problems. So there's the danger of you becoming overly dependent. You know, if you find out that it works, then you just go down that road even further and you become overly dependent on that resource. So those are the sort of the 4 biggest general findings, I think, in terms of ensuring that resource development benefits, you know, and then I just wanted to finish, well, future directions. This is, you know, since ISER really is one of the pioneers of talking about these issues, then, you know, if you have any future directions, I'd really like to hear them. In terms of, can't move the thing.
Looks like the future direction is
Yes.
limited.
There you go.
In terms of 2 things that, well, one thing that we did develop an atlas of resource development for northern Canada. And we've tried to, in fact, include some Alaskan sites in this atlas, but we know that another project, REXAC, which is a Swedish, it's a Nordic nation project. They are going to build on this and integrate, so it becomes a library of resource development in the Arctic. And so we're, you know, if anybody in Alaska is interested in this, to add in Alaskan things, then we'd be interested in talking to you about that as well.
That's just on the web someplace?
That's on the web, yeah. It's on, if you go to our website, which is www.resda.ca, then you can access this. And it's just like a library. So you click on these and they'll, communities can have access. Often communities say, well, what's the agreement that they had, the IBA agreement? Well, at one time, all IBA agreements were confidential. Now they're becoming much more open. And so if a community wants to see what the IBA agreement in the Raglan mine in Nunavik, they just click on it, and we have a copy here on this site. The history of the mines, the employment statistics are all available on these sites. So it's sort of like an internet library. And then we have a YouTube channel which has sort of interviews with peoples in the community, talking about resource development, and also little clips of Lee Huskey giving his presentations in various areas and presenting their findings. And great, thank you. This is our website, and all the information you need to know. Good. So I can answer any questions.
Well, I'm thinking about the next steps, and of course, my rant, but I think it's really clear here, which is around the human capital / knowledge dissemination and communities being able to develop that knowledge. And of course, Andrew and I have worked together over the years, so I'm very familiar with the distressing findings. The findings here are consistent with his doctoral research findings, where he was looking at programs attempting to create a pipeline per settlement agreements for training Indigenous people to move into resource extractive industries. And they'd start with 25 people and they'd end up with 4 even completing their training program and 2 going into the jobs. So there's really some disconnect going on that I think that there's this combination of communities feeling like they own the project, are they understanding the healing that still needs to happen from the long legacy of colonization and what it has meant for these communities, that they may be looking at mines as, yeah, great, give us some money, but this is nothing that we deserve or have a way to control. So I think that we gotta get in there and start talking with the communities about the skills that they have. Because I think that's the other part, is I think communities underestimate their own knowledge and their own skills to contribute back in. And then how do you build identification of who wants to be doing what are the skills you need, and how do you collaborate with these, before that money goes away.
Yeah. Good.
Well, I'd say first that your list of ReSDA projects doesn't include ReSDA-inspired projects. There are 2 of those, which I hope to be able to report on soon. One is actually looking at local benefits of the Red Dog mine, and that study is complete, at least this first initial stage, and it's in peer review, and I'll be able to talk about it as soon as the peer review is completed, which hopefully will be within the next few months. And then another one is also about so that's looking at the local rather than the overall benefits, looking at how much of those actually benefit local people and how the other study is about the community development quota program, which is an example of the collective institution, that really distributes the benefits collectively rather than individually. And that one is currently, since we did it at the Census Data Center, it's in disclosure review by the Census Bureau, and who knows if and when that will ever be released, but it looks at whether we've identified long-term individual or benefits to the communities that participate in the community development quota program relative to ones that are similar nearby but didn't qualify because they were on the other side of the 50-mile boundary. But they were both inspired by ReSDA, and I could say, even though I didn't get any funding from ReSDA, except the ability to travel and meet with the group, that was enough to inspire me to do these projects, and most importantly, to be able to meet Terry Rodon.
Yeah.
And it's I wish, it's a long ways to Quebec City.
Yeah.
And he works at a Francophone university, so there's some barriers to collaboration, but I'm still looking for ways to do that.
Well, and then the third thing, if I wasn't speaking in Alaska, I would have, under the thing, under Stefan Schott is Matt's work on poverty and
Oh, yes, I
Southern
can say
wealth
that too,
funds.
which also was inspired by meeting Stefan Schott and talking to him about that.
Yeah,
Exactly, so that's a third.
And the communities are really interested in that, is that, I don't know if, I'm hoping this is true, but I think your studies have indicated that the Alaska Permanent Fund payments, what are they called? They're not called dividends. That's right. They can be seen to reduce poverty by as much as a quarter in these communities.
That's right, although the data don't show that because the data aren't accurate.
The census
The
data.
census data, which
Yeah.
is the only data
Right.
that we have, systematically doesn't actually count the income of children, which of course is dividends paid to children. It's a big omission, and
Yeah.
enough to skew the poverty rates by at least 10%, or sometimes 15% in these rural communities.
But yeah, in many ways, ISER.
Overestimated. Poverty is overestimated. Right.
In many ways, ISER sort of was ReSDA before ReSDA. I mean, you'd been working on these questions already for a long period of time because you guys, and the reason is Alaska was really the first place in the North to have its own really become politically empowered, have its own, major resource development with the North Slope and having to deal with all that.
So I'm going to ask a question. First, a sort of a question. This is a wonderful summary overview. Is this written up, or are you going to write it up and publish it? Because I'd love to see like a review article of what has been learned. And so so that's the easy question. But the harder one is Diane pointed to, she said human capital is a big issue. But when I looked at the findings, I saw that yes, human capital is an issue, but it's people making decisions not to acquire it. And the Red Dog case, the Red Dog mine, if you don't have a high school, you need a high school degree to be able to work there, and so that inspires some people to finish just so they can try it out, even if they don't really want to work there and don't stay. But then they've got the lifetime benefit, and so but it seems to me, from my reading of your findings, that the biggest obstacle here for northern communities to be able to benefit from the mining is institutional capacity, which is much more difficult to develop than human capital because it involves not only necessarily building the right institutions that are culturally appropriate, but also figuring out how to get them to work and be recognized, empowered. It requires multiple levels of coordination and effort, and I just don't see anybody really putting a whole lot of policy direction into that at any level of government, and that sort of concerns me. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, there has been major, in terms of building institutional capacity, obviously the devolution of power to the territorial governments has increased the institutional. What used to be the case that from one case you can look at the communities, but it used to be the case that nobody has. I mean, Alaska had a state government, which allowed them to build institutional capacity for starting in 1959, but the territories had no government until recently, and so devolution is helping to build that, and devolution is occurring, I think, and Lee and I were talking about this with the Faro. The Faro mine, probably the biggest thing might be the biggest thing that Faro mine did was sort of justify devolution, giving the Yukon powers of close to that of, I guess, what you would say is the state.
Well, that has not really happened in Alaska, with one major exception, which has sort of proves the point, in that the devolution that did take place is in healthcare delivery, and where the government used to provide it, and now they contract to the tribes. Well, now we have tribal capacity to deliver healthcare, and it's been a huge benefit for economic development, providing jobs and training and stuff, and encouraging human capital development. And so it's like, we have this example that did work. Why don't we take advantage of it?
Actually, I think that institutional, because when you said there wasn't government, there wasn't Canadian Western government in these places. There were tribal governments all along, but they were never given the power. The power, and not only were they not given the power, but the systematic attacks on traditional lifestyles and traditional institutions meant that places, you get the stories of sled dogs being killed and then snow machines being brought in, but then snow machines require money to pay for fuel. And so there was this whole undermining of the traditional structures that might have been able to develop this in an entirely different way that we can't imagine.
So then here's the question for all of them, everybody. Why didn't ANCSA do that? It was supposed to, or it could have, but it didn't. Why not? It created a bit in urban Alaska.
Yeah. It imposed a very Western structure, even in the effort to create capacity, in the effort to create wealth. It did it in a way that was still culturally weird, and in terms of the regional corporations, the geography it loosely works with the tribal boundaries, but not entirely. It created artificial collaborations and inequitable resource distribution just because some parts of the state have more natural resources than other. And some parts of the state had more Western capacity through the intersections. Southeast had trees, and it had people that have been trading and working with Western as well as other indigenous cultures for decades, if not hundreds of years, and had a different skill set to intersect than did some of the other communities. And so it really...
Well, I'm curious about, Chris, what you have your perspective on this issue from ReSDA and from the Canadian experience.
I would have to, I would think that most people think that at least the basic structure is in place to build institutional capacity in the North with the land claim organizations. You talked about ANCSA, the problems with ANCSA. Well, they were aware of that. I mean, this notion of being a shareholder is kind of abhorrent to a lot of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So a lot of that sort of aspect of it, the corporations had to be profit oriented. That was done away with in the land claim. And so the land claims the modern land claims, most people believe, I haven't done a study, but I get the gut feeling that most people think that they're good, but you can't really activate a lot of the potential benefits of the land claims because you don't have any money. You don't have any development. And so to do all the potential things you could do within the structure of the land claim organizations, you really can't do in terms of building institutional capacity in the communities and to build culturally appropriate forms of institutional capacity. That you're not able to do that because you don't have the financial resources,
But the development of institutional capacity, if my reading of the history of ReSDA is correct, one indicator of that is, you were hand in glove with Indigenous organizations throughout the North who were able to come up with questions, it showed a little, some human capital and focused on a concern for regional level. So again, that's an indicator of, maybe we can't, maybe the institutional capacity doesn't develop as fast as the tribal consortiums, the health tribal consortiums did, but there's stuff going on there.
But that you need money. I don't know Alaska enough to know how all of a sudden that they got the money to build these health things from whether it was from
transfer of money, just like the services were contracted to these organizations. So the money that used to go to the government,
federal government or the state?
The money for so in the United States, Canadians who have single-payer health care, well, in the United States, we have single-payer health care. We actually have government-provided health care for single-payer in Medicare for the elderly, and for poor people on Medicaid, and for military and veterans, the military and veterans, and for Native Americans, which add up to about half the population.
Yeah.
So-
And in the case of the rural Alaska, it would be much more than half.
Yeah.
The tribal system gets 20% maybe of its revenues from the Indian Health Service, 25.
Okay.
25% from, again, statewide, it'd be much higher in rural areas. 25% from Medicaid, probably 20% from Medicare. Where it's a relatively high VA population also, retired
So
veterans.
they're providing the services with a mix of federal funds and even some private, insurance funds for enroll, their members who actually have employment provided, employer provided healthcare.
And the other thing is, these institutions were formed at a very opportunistic time because Medicare and Medicaid in the US dramatically expanded in the mid-60s. So there's a period of very rapid growth in services. So the IHS has always been there, but Medicaid and Medicare are growing very rapidly throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the sources of, and these are all federal funds. In the case of Medicaid, there was a statutory change, so although our Medicaid is 50% state, 50% federal, the money going to the tribal system is 100% federal. So there was at this time, in some sense it wasn't intentional that the revenue was coming in at exactly the time these institutions were being built.
Right.
That is what happened that allowed them to grow.
But to get them started, the Indian Health Service, it's a per capita payment that is in the Indian Health Service's budget that was provided by, Indian Health Service is a federal agency. It was providing the service. And so that money then gets contracted to tribes. The tribes then hire the same providers who are working for the government.
Right.
But now is in control of not only the personnel, but the type of services and the way that the services are provided, and can sort of start moving towards a more culturally appropriate form of healthcare delivery.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in Canada they're aware of the sort of the capacity that's been built in Alaska. I know that I've been asked to come back to Alaska to study what's going on in the healthcare, the management system for Indigenous peoples here, because there's an interest among certain Indigenous organizations in Canada. So there's an awareness of that, and yeah, I mean, it sounds like they found some way of accessing the resources necessary to help build that institutional capacity. And whether Canadians can do that, whether Canadian Indigenous people in the North can do that is another. But most people seem to think that the only way to do that would be through resource development, sort of the big, or if they're going to have that opportunity, they need a North Slope type of thing, which is probably not ever going to happen.
But that's a real point. The difference between Alaska and the mining you're looking at, oil generates very large rents, right? And those rents can be captured by the North Slope borough, they can be captured by the state.
Right.
Mining generates pretty modest rents. The opportunities in mining are basically in employment.
Right.
Unlike oil, where the employment opportunities are, in the scale of things, modest and very substantially from outside because of the technology.
Right.
Mining has the opportunity for local employment, but that's really what it brings. That's very different, it seems to me, from, we are doing, obviously we're doing some mining in Red Dog, and there's a lot of talk about developing the Ambler Road District, but the Ambler Road District is not going to be another Prudhoe Bay for us.
No, but I also have to say that in the case of oil, it's different because, first of all, it was developed earlier.
Yeah.
Before, but mainly the state, it's state oil, owns oil, not the indigenous people.
Yeah.
So there was really no institutional leverage for getting this, whereas in the Red Dog mine, it's a joint venture between the Native Corporation and.
Right, the wealth in the oil, besides being obviously, like you were saying, the rent, is also in the settlement when they didn't meet the quotas that they were supposed to in developing the pipeline, and that money went to First Alaskans and the AFN and to other places like that, not to individual communities.
And so I should say that one place that it would be nice to study, but we probably can't because the community has been impacted to death and studied to death, is New Wixit, which is close enough to the Prudhoe Bay oil fields that is now basically in the middle of it.
And it is.
Because the Native Corporation does control access to the land, they have generated lots of benefits for the community, and the question there is, well, there's so many benefits and so much wealth that that becomes toxic, and it doesn't, and no matter how much money people have, if you're surrounded by oil fields, subsistence gets to be sort of difficult to continue, and so the community may, that's a sustainability problem where you just have basically too much of a potentially good thing.
They've got multiple things going on because climate change is also impacting them hugely. And then they've got the social issue. I sat next to a health aide on my flight out of Ukqiagvik this week, and she said it's just insane. They're hugely impacted.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have 300 people, and there's oil, there's billions of dollars of oil infrastructure surrounding the community, and we're getting added.
Yeah.
And you can see it from town, and you can hear it. Helicopters flying overhead.
Lights,
The lights, yeah.
So we should bring the
Anyway, I
formal
just-
part to an end, and of course, people can continue to talk all they want.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is the giant mine movie on the website?
No, it's on a website, but it's on, I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
He's going to the